In this film, I'm going to say some things about race that we normally never say on television. By the first commercial break, you may be wondering whether I'm breaking every equality law in the book. I'm not. I should know. I helped to create those laws, and I used to be their enforcer. My name is Trevor Phillips. For 10 years, I led Britain's equality commissions. It was my job to make sure that different racial and religious groups got on. Campaigners like me sincerely believed that if we could prevent people expressing prejudiced ideas, then eventually they'd stop thinking them. But now, I'm convinced that we were utterly wrong. In a world riven by racial and religious strife, some things are just too important to be left unsaid, even if they might offend people. So in this film, I'm going to say some of the things that we once told you were forbidden. And I know that in the next 5 minutes, some of you will be saying, I don't care what color he is. He's being totally racist. This is Parliament Hill. It's one of the highest spots in North London. From my earliest days, I had a pretty good idea of who lived where around here. So, if you look straight through there, that's where we first settled when my parents came here in 1950, and they lived next to the Irish, near Arsenal football ground in Highbury. My mother's best friend was Irish Peggy. They sewed furs together in a sweatshop. Then when we got maybe a little bit better off, we moved around here to Green Lanes, which is where the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots settled. And then if you go a bit further around, you will see White Hart Lane, which is where Spurs have their ground in Tottenham. And every Saturday afternoon, of course, Spurs fans would come, a lot of them Jewish, to see the match. But the Jewish people didn't live in Tottenham. That's where we lived. They lived round there, in this rather greener, nicer part, in Highgate, in Hampstead, over there in Golders Green. So even at the age of 7 or 8, I had a really good ethnic map of North London in my head. Of course, everybody who lives here knows all this. But as you grow up, you realize that polite people don't talk about this kind of thing. But that's exactly what I'm going to do. Yes, it does say what you think it says, and I know nobody usually says that out loud. But is it true? Throughout recorded history, Jews have been vilified. Anti-Semites accused them of amassing great wealth and of sinister influence. This is the new West End Synagogue in Bayswater. This fabulous stained glass window is just one of the treasures of this jewel of a synagogue in the heart of London. It cost a packet to build, and obviously it costs a lot to maintain it. But from the start, the congregation has been able to call on the wealth and the devotion of its most successful members. Amongst them, the most successful banking dynasty in history. The Rothschilds were the Jewish billionaires of their time, but what of their modern-day successors? Out of Britain's entire population, fewer than 1 in 200 of us is Jewish. That's less than half of 1%. Today, there are just over 100 billionaires in the UK. Statistically, there should be hardly any Jews on the list. In fact, they make up a fifth of Britain's billionaires club. What all that tells us is that some Jews are very, very rich indeed. But maybe the billionaires are some kind of aberration. Not exactly. The net wealth of the average British household is just over £200,000. But the average British Jewish household turns out to be more than twice as wealthy. about the powerful thing? Well, if this is the national seat of power, you'd expect to see just 3 or 4 Jewish MPs in the House of Commons.
In fact, there are 22. There are, of course, other ways of measuring power. Take business. In comparison to the average, Jewish people are over 3 times as likely to be top managers in a FTSE 100 company. Or finance. Jews are 4 times as likely to be non-executive directors in banking. We know why speaking of Jews in this way makes most of us uneasy. 70 years after the Nazis' defeat, the long shadow of their crimes still makes even simple facts unsayable. Any talk that hints of Jewish superiority evokes just one set of images.
Das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende.
The real point's this. We shouldn't envy other more successful groups. We shouldn't fear them. After all, each of us is a creature of our own family background, our cultural inheritance, the neighborhoods we grew up in. What we should actually be doing is learning from them.
The organizations I led worked hard to prevent people perpetuating racial stereotypes. But we were swimming against the tide because many of them are largely true. Yes, Irish people do tend to dominate the building trade. And Greek Cypriots are more likely to run small businesses. And it really isn't racist to observe that Indian women are 8 times as likely to be your local chemist as the average person.
The thing is, there's no prejudice in numbers. I don't think we should be put off talking about ethnic patterns of behaviour because of what bigots and racists might say.
Of course, even positive stereotypes can make some people feel a bit uncomfortable. But things get really explosive when you ask who's committing which crimes. May 1997, Tony Blair sweeps to power. Part of what was supposed to make New Labour really new was its enthusiastic embrace of multi-ethnic Britain.
We can't be a beacon to the world unless the talents of all the people shine through.
When the Blair government asked me to lead the Commission for Racial Equality, both to them and me it seemed a crucial role. And I had, in some respects, had a lifetime's preparation.
I'm driving through the area where I grew up, doing something that millions of people do every day. It's a kind of unofficial motoring offence called driving while black. I've managed it in a Citroën Diane, in a Mazda, in a Volvo, and even in a Jaguar, some sort of social mobility record, I guess. Nothing wakes you up to your colour as sharply as being stopped and hearing the words IC3, which is cop talk for black, coming at you back through the police radio as they check that you haven't stolen your own car. It's the kind of thing that's convinced people like me, black Britons, that if you're going to be stopped by the police, they're going to regard you as a potential criminal.
Back in 1980, you didn't see many black folk talking about this, or anything else for that matter, on TV. But that April, I had the chance to tell people who are not black exactly what it felt like.
There we are, and here we go. Mr. Trevor Phillips is president of the National Union of Students. He's the first black holder of that position. He's 26 and was born in Islington of Guyanese parents. His great-grandmother was a slave in Barbados.
This is just 24 hours after black youths and police had fought a pitched battle in Bristol.
Can I finish what I'm saying, please?
They were there with a search warrant. Now, let's get the facts right.
Yes, but if you have a search warrant hidden somewhere in your person, none of the people in the club had X-ray vision to know that they had a search warrant.
Thing.
Oh!
When they had a search warrant.
I'm sorry. Hang on, I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry, sir.
It all seemed so simple back in the 80s. We saw the police as the bad guys. But in 2003, an assistant commissioner of the Met showed me new research that massively complicated the picture. Tariq Ghafoor used to be the highest-ranking minority policeman in the country. A decade on and now out of the Met, he's agreed to talk publicly about the data he had compiled. It was then, and is still, incendiary.
If you take West London, which is Hounslow, areas around there, basically large South Asian, Somali kind of network. We found violence, drugs, a lot of protection rackets. And then as you go towards East London, you've got Newham, a very strong South Asian, Pakistani influence, a couple of very nasty murders up there. You get into Hackney, you've got the Turkish influence with heroin. Then as you come down into the south, the Chinese factor, particularly human trafficking for sex trade purposes, largely taking place in the middle. And of course, the very big Eastern European factor, in central London where, Romanian pickpocketing gangs or, ATM machine attacks there by the Eastern Europeans.
There was another criminal network operating in South London that Tariq's unit had spotted.
We'll go towards Stockwell Tube.
The widely held view a decade ago was that the African Caribbean drug gangs dominated crime in Lambeth. In fact, the serious crime in the area was run by Colombians.
We were building quite a strong surveillance picture, intelligence picture on large-scale cocaine importation into London from Colombia, a network that was worth up to about 200 million pounds. Wow. And our teams were following some of these drug dealers, and believe me or not, here, some of these guys were carrying up to 50,000 pounds that accumulated from drug deals, right, around an area that is sometimes a robbery hotspot, street crime hotspot. So they were never touched.
It's obviously really important to understand who is doing what, so you target the right people. Because actually people think Brixton, black crime.
Yeah, no.
But actually the big crime here was Colombian.
Absolutely, because if you generically go for people, then what you end up doing is upsetting the whole community, stigmatizing them, stereotyping. But intelligence-led policing is about using the data, building the evidence, and then going in. And I can tell you now, Trevor, no community would not give you a mandate for that type of operation to take place.
Many equality campaigners worry about relying on ethnic crime data. They think it will be misused. But I think it's minority communities who lose out, often terrorized and used as camouflage by criminals.
The top tier of criminality, organized criminality, were living in these particular flats.
These guys who are turning over hundreds of millions, they're living on a council estate.
Yeah, they are, because it gives them relative safety.
Back then, none of this figured in the public debate about police-community relations.
Do you think there was nervousness at what might look like racial profiling or preparing to stigmatize one community or another?
Unfortunately, there has been, over the years, great politicization of policing. And to a certain extent, we seem to have created this totally unnecessary mantra that, there are certain communities, if you do something that is going to impact actually positively on safety and security, that becomes racist. Or
the anxiety, I suppose, would be, God, yeah, maybe you'll get more criminals, but people might think we're a bit racist.
Correct.
The idea that different groups really do commit different crimes may sound like a racial slur, but it's true. Let's take pickpocketing in London. Here's the number of arrests the Met made for that offence in 2012. Of those, over a third were from a single group, Romanians. Some people would say it's dangerous to pick out Romanians in this way. Experts call it racial profiling and worry that it encourages the police to discriminate. But would it still be racist if we could accurately say something similar about other ethnic groups? Consider black people in England and Wales. They're over twice as likely to be sentenced for violent crime than the average, and over 6 times more likely to be sentenced for robbery. And white Britons? Well, alcohol-fueled crime seems to be their speciality.
None of these statistics tells us why they're true, but they are. I don't think we should be shy about trying to find out what they mean. But even some of my best friends would say, that way lies madness.
Simon Woolley is a long-time equality activist. Together we waged a successful campaign on Stop and Search. We made our breakthrough by crunching mountains of data to show that the police weren't just discriminating, they were wasting time and money. Still, we don't always see eye to eye.
Do you think it would be wrong to use ethnicity data against criminals in the way that we used it against the cops?
No. I'm not sure about that. Why would you say that you have a black gang in London and you have a white gang in Glasgow? You wouldn't. They'd be gangs and they'd be involved in criminality. There's no need to racially code a gang if it's a gang.
Well, sometimes the gangs are gangs because they are racially coded. There are crime families, there are organisations which are based on ethnicities. All sorts of groups have crime. So why would it be wrong to be able to talk publicly about that fact?
No, but it's not. The danger is when it gets too lazy and a catch-all description. Nobody wants to go down there. So if it's nuanced, then fine. But if it's this headline, you've got to do something about black gangs, it's dangerous. You know that, and I know that.
Sure, we can't control the newspapers, but my point is, the longer we keep sort of soft-peddling this and pretending that it's not really true, you know, the more we keep sort of fuzzing these things, the harder it is to tackle. And the more these things become myths.
Sure, yes.
Which affect the whole community.
I mean, I don't think you have to fudge it. I don't think you have to dodge it. You just have to be articulate about it. And if you are, you can talk about it as it is, without having this generic stuff going on, Trevor. That's what I worry about. We have a lazy media. We often have lazy politicians, and they will take what you say, and too often, you've seen this time and time again, they will use that to beat us with.
But I would say that what you're now doing is inviting me to self-edit according to the values set by the Daily Mail and the Sun.
Well, I'm just saying we have to be mindful.
Yeah, but the point is, whatever you say, they're going to follow their line.
Then don't make it easy.
And our problem then is that we never talk about any of these things.
Oh, we can talk about it.
We're also afraid to say anything because we think it'll be misused, that we just shut up. Right. And we never tackle any of these questions.
We have to be smart, Trevor.
But what does smart mean? Some would argue that the real factors behind these patterns are poverty, lack of education, and discrimination in the justice system. But for me, that can't be the whole picture. Some racial patterns aren't explained away so easily. Take murder. In England and Wales, if you're white, you have a 9 in 1 million annual chance of being murdered. But if you're black, that goes up to a 26 in 1 million chance, almost 3 times as likely. But of those black victims, most, 3/4, are killed by black perpetrators. That's an awkward fact for anyone who believes that the major cause of black disadvantage is discrimination by whites. Like many people faced with some inconvenient truths, I rather hope that if I sat on them long enough, they'd go away by themselves, and maybe they would have done. But then something happened that forced me to face up to the realities.
I don't know how it all happened.
By 2005, it felt as though we'd gone a long way to changing Britain. London's pitch for the 2012 Olympic Games was based on the success of our drive to embrace diversity.
Awarded the City of London.
When the verdict was announced, it felt as though the world had given us a stamp of approval. The new Labour vision of Britain as a multi-ethnic, multicultural beacon was at the heart of London's victory. For us in the Equality Commissions, not quite job done, but certainly a good day at the office.
This is BBC London. Good morning, Pete.
Good morning. We're just trying to figure out exactly what this is. We've been told that there was something that happened during the rush hour this morning.
And yet, less than 24 hours later, this happened. 4 bombers had struck London's transport system, killing 52 people and injuring more than 700. Within hours, a grim-faced Prime Minister appealed for unity.
When they try to divide our people or weaken our resolve, we will not be divided, and our resolve will hold firm.
But when the country learned that those bombers were British Muslims, our unity was balanced on a knife edge. Suddenly, I was being pressed to explain what this meant for community relations. Yet, for nearly 3 months, other than joining in the appeal for calm, I elected to remain silent.
The truth is, I was stunned by what had taken place here. After 9/11, most of us had expected some kind of terrorist attack on Britain. Few expected this kind of violence to come from young men born and brought up in the UK, speaking in the accents of Yorkshire and London. This really wasn't supposed to happen according to our version of events. So what had we all missed?
Over the following 10 weeks, we did some serious soul-searching and some detailed research. Our key conclusion? The ugly perversion of Islam that had led to this carnage would thrive only in isolated communities. By late September, I was ready to say my piece. But I already knew the message was one nobody really wanted to hear.
The aftermath of 7/7 forces us to assess where we are. And here is where I think we are. We are sleepwalking our way to segregation. We are becoming strangers to each other, and we are leaving communities to be marooned outside the mainstream.
Politicians of every party queued up to say that I was wrong.
I don't agree with Trevor Phillips' suggestion that we're almost like that sort of segregation in America at the moment.
Whether segregation is the right word, I'm not too sure. That word grates somewhat with me.
Angriest of all were my friends in New Labour, who saw my remarks as a kind of betrayal.
I don't agree with Trevor Phillips' claim that we're marching headlong to segregation. The American comparison, in my view, is completely fatuous. We've got to be pretty careful with our facts here, so we shouldn't be complacent, but I think the alarmism is very misplaced.
I thought Trevor Phillips was a New Labour man.
But what I'd realised that summer is that it's not about what you want to believe, it's about what's true. The belief behind the New Labour mission was that if we could solve the problem of discrimination, then racial barriers would come down, integration between communities would naturally follow.
The man up there at the back.
But we'd reckoned without human nature. Left to themselves,
When I uttered the S word a decade ago, all sorts of people leapt in to accuse me of being alarmist, and I understand why. If you spend your day working alongside someone of a different ethnicity, it's quite easy to forget what happens when you're not at work. We call it sunset segregation. We may often be workmates, but at the end of the day, we tend not to be neighbours.
This is Leicester, one of the country's first majority-minority cities.
The city's leaders are incredibly proud of the fact that they've become the poster boy for multicultural Britain. But the daily exodus that's about to take place tells a very different story.
Take any bus home from the city centre and your colour's likely to be a clue to your destination. Here are the parts of Leicester which are over 2/3 British and white. And here are the areas that are around 2/3 British and Asian. East or west, it looks like you're heading to a segregated district. You'll find similar patterns in cities across the country. During the sleepwalking to segregation controversy, one key New Labour figure did not join in the condemnation.
It is a fact of life that people tend to want to live where people like them live.
Jack Straw's Blackburn constituency is one of the most segregated in the country.
If you got out a map, I could say the people in that area come from this part of India, the people in that area come from another Indian area, but not very far away, by the way, and this is a Pakistani area, and these people come from here, and these people come from there.
I knew from the age of 7 where the Irish lived, where we lived, where the Turks lived, and so on. But we are not comfortable talking about this, are we?
Well, there is a sort of polite society in which people aren't comfortable about talking about this, but I think that in politics you have a responsibility to get things out in the open. I am concerned about the effect of people living wholly separate lives, of course, but you can't direct where people live.
Why do you think that there is essentially such a silence on these questions?
I think a lot of white politicians are nervous about this. They lack confidence about what their views are and think that somebody will criticise them if they come out with them.
Somebody will call them racist?
Racist or some nonsense like that.
People of Jack's and my generation believed that if you got rid of discrimination, Britain's racial divisions would heal, with multi-ethnic London leading the way. But it just hasn't happened. London's population has grown by more than 1 million over the last decade. But look at that increase again, in a little more detail. Here are the white British Londoners at the start of that decade. As the overall population goes up, the number of white British Londoners drops by well over 500,000. That's the equivalent of a group the size of Glasgow's population leaving London, all of them British and white. This is Professor Eric Kaufman. He examines ethnic population movements, and he's crunched the numbers from the latest census.
What is going on there? Are the white Brits just running away from people like me?
We can't tie it to a racist motivation or a dislike of diversity, at least not a conscious dislike of diversity. If you're white British, you're more likely to have friends and family living in white places. So just by virtue of following friends and family, that creates this segregation pattern.
By and large, I don't think the motivations for this pattern are sinister. But I've always believed that separate streets and neighbourhoods would pretty quickly lead to separate ways of life and separate values. And that's exactly why I started to worry after 7/7. Just weeks after the sleepwalking to segregation controversy broke out here, in Paris, young Muslims erupted in protest at the conditions in the notoriously segregated suburbs where most of them lived. Other French cities quickly followed. The French government appealed to my commission for advice. We said, you've got to get rid of the ghettos. They failed, and 10 years later, this happened. Young Muslims from the suburbs wreaked havoc on the streets of Paris, leaving their nation in crisis. Segregation alone didn't cause this terrorism, but I think it's one of the conditions that allowed it to thrive.
I don't know how it all happened. It was just a regular Thursday night. We had some friends over and I made them one of my...
Thursday morning, West London. one of Britain's wealthiest workforces clocks in. It's also one of the most diverse. Welcome to the Premier League. A third of the league's players are black. Over 50 nations are represented. But the game is far from being a model for multicultural Britain. Meet Les Ferdinand, one of the dominant players of his generation, and a key figure in the most talked about racial incident in recent football history. A clash that involved his cousin.
Breaking news on John Terry.
Former QPR defender Anton Ferdinand thought he was on the end of a racially charged tirade. John Terry maintained he was quoting back a racist slur, indignant that he had been misheard. British media organisations circulated the slowed down and magnified footage of the incident, allowing the nation's lip readers to get to work.
Okay, here we go. Right. What was your view about John Terry?
I suppose it was disbelief, really, that the England captain would use language like that on a football field or anywhere, in fact.
How do you feel that the game handled it?
Terribly, and I think it's a situation that could have been put to bed quite quickly. And when you look at the game and you know, the disproportion of black coaches in the game, maybe they're not actually saying what John Terry said, but are they thinking it? Because I have to believe that.
Well, that brings me to a sort of key point, which is really about you. You're a distinguished footballer. You had a great career, international. You're respected in the game. How many times have you been tapped up to be considered for a first-team coach?
Since I've retired from football, once.
Once?
Yeah, once. When I came out of football, I spoke to the then chairman of Bournemouth.
So, in the 7 years since you've retired, you've been talked to about a management vacancy once, and that by an owner who himself was not white.
Yeah, that's right.
That tells a story, doesn't it?
It does.
If I look at the newspapers, there are millions of stories about what John Terry might have said to Anton Ferdinand. There's almost no coverage on the question, why isn't Les Ferdinand a manager? And there are other players like yourself, black players. None of you is a first-team coach. It seems to me that the priorities there are just completely wrong.
Yeah, I agree. I know lots of players that I play with who'd love to go into coaching and management and done all the badges, but just won't get an opportunity, you know. We've been talking about this for 15 years now. The only difference is the venues seem to be getting better. You know, when I first started doing it, it was in a little classroom. Then we moved on to a hotel room. Now we're at Parliament. But the outcome's still the same because we've not moved on.
The truth is that complaining about individual incidents doesn't get you very far in dealing with structural inequalities. Or to put it another way, it's no wonder that progress on racial equality can seem so slow. Too often, we've aimed at the wrong target, and even when we do pick the right one, we've frequently used the wrong weapons. When I arrived at the Commission for Racial Equality in 2003, officials showed me an award-winning poster campaign aimed at pricking the conscience of the nation.
Admen and anti-racists alike were thrilled. And I was about to bung another £1 million on a campaign just like this one, until I saw the results of research into its impact that I'd commissioned. In fact, it had seriously misfired.
Our research showed no evidence that it changed a single racist's mind. But what it did achieve, however, was to make many white people feel that they were being accused in the dock for something they hadn't done. With hindsight, it's easy to see that we were beginning to undermine our own cause. But when you're on a mission, it's not always possible to spot the warning signs.
Taking your calls, your texts, your emails, talking about the big stories for London, getting your thoughts on them, and shaking up the place in terms of getting responses from the people that matter.
The moment that I should have known that things were going seriously wrong, I was sitting in the back of a cab. Radio was on. Bloke came on a phone-in, and he said, "I'd like to say what I think, but then you'd think I was racist, and Trevor Phillips and the Commission for Racial Equality would come round and arrest me." Well, the fact that he thought I had that kind of power, which I didn't, and that I would use it to arrest people for having politically incorrect thoughts, should have been a big fat warning that people didn't understand what we were doing and that they didn't like it. But like everybody else, I ignored the warning until it was too late. It isn't easy to say exactly when I knew that we needed to stop and take stock if we were to get our equality mission back on track. But I do know that what started as a few nagging doubts turned into a certainty that the rules of the game had changed, and not entirely for the better.
The organisers of this tournament say that over 500 million people worldwide play the game, and you can see the diversity represented here. Of course, on the board, only two colours matter, black and white. And according to the laws of chess, they carry equal status and equal weight. The laws of race relations are somewhat different, and from the time I was a child, I knew what those laws were. 1, all blacks are alike. 2, all blacks are inferior. 3, all blacks are required to be subordinate and to know their place.
Today, few children, black or white, would accept those rules. Martin Luther King's vision changed the way people thought about race and gave the world a new ideal. But history shows that a noble set of aims just isn't enough.
There's always a risk with great reform movements. We start with good intentions, we turn those into a set of informal laws, and then they become dogma.
Revolutions have a way of getting out of hand. What starts as a march of liberation can end up with thought control, and worse. Unwittingly, I think we gave birth to an ugly new doctrine. The new doctrine says, 1, all whites are alike. 2, all whites are guilty and tainted. 3, no white person should ever criticize someone who's not white. London, February 2000. Victoria Clembier, an 8-year-old Ivorian girl, starved and tortured allegedly because her guardians thought she was possessed by demons. Rushed to hospital in a critical condition, Victoria eventually died of 128 separate injuries. The inquiry that followed blamed poverty, miscommunication, and incompetence.
But for me, one thing came through loud and clear. Pretty much everyone who could have saved this little girl's life was walking on eggshells. Why? Because I think they were paralyzed by fear that if they intervened in a black family, they'd be accused of being racist.
White managers worried about criticizing black juniors. Doctors attributed Victoria's scars to insect bites from her African childhood. Social workers saw the child's terror of her guardians as behavior typical in black families. Everybody said they cared. And still, she died. Rotherham, 2003.
When people are saying in Rotherham they didn't know what was going on, I can believe them because I didn't know what was going on. It was a bolt out of the blue.
That summer, the then MP for Keighley, Anne Cryer, was visited by a delegation of local women. What they told her left her aghast.
I had 7 mothers of 7 girls who were being groomed from school. These lads were waiting for them outside the school gate, and they flattered these girls, and the girls went along with it.
How old were they?
Oh, they were only about 12 or 13, very young. And this was the problem that their mothers had. They knew that there was sexual activity with girls who were underage. Not entirely, but nearly always, the gangs are from the Mirpuri Pakistani community. And these 7 women were saying, it's not fair, we've told West Yorkshire Police about it, we've told social services about it, and no one will do anything. I mean, friends of mine in the Labour Party, they'd known about it for years, and had never mentioned it to me.
Did you feel sort of, in any way, politically inhibited from talking about this?
Yeah, I did, actually. It was difficult for me to make these arguments without being called a racist. I just couldn't interest either Bradford Social Services or West Yorkshire Police. And it was very distressing for me. So the last resort was to go public.
Revealed, the teenage girls being groomed for underage sex. The accused men are Asian, the girls are white.
The suggestion that men are seeking out schoolgirls for sex would be controversial in any community. But the claims about what's happening here in Keighley are particularly incendiary.
Andrew Norfolk is now the chief investigative reporter for The Times. When he first heard about this story, his liberal angst kicked in immediately.
My reaction was, how on earth do you cover this story? Because it's the dream story for the far right. I as a journalist, wrote a simple story, a single story, and moved on and hoped it wasn't true. More shame on me, because as the years passed, I then began to see, as stories came in from across the north and the Midlands, little by little, drip, drip, court cases with 2 or 3 or 4 men up for sex offences against children, and that very same pattern kept repeating it and repeating itself, and I couldn't help noticing that invariably the men, they were from the Pakistani community in the vast majority of cases. Eventually it got to such a point that in 2010 I said, you know, to the newspaper, I think there's something really disturbing going on here and nobody's recognised it, and you need to give me some time to look into it. We'd run our first story about this hidden crime pattern in January 2011. And I'd steeled myself for the inevitable accusations that would come.
Did you think people were saying, this bloke Norfolk, he's a bit of a racist?
Well, they were. I read articles, I read comments in various social media networks. It was quite strange and deeply unpleasant to get to the age of 45 and for the very first time in your life be accused of being racist.
This is a story about what happens in a climate where people feel it's far too difficult to speak openly about race. Both Anne Cryer and Andrew Norfolk would regard themselves as liberal-minded people, yet they were vilified for saying something that liberal Britain just didn't want to hear. And once the truth was out, you'd think that the first thing to do would be to make sure that vulnerable children knew that they were at risk.
That's why, in 2008, child protection chiefs commissioned this film to warn young girls of the dangers they faced.
My Dangerous Lover Boy very accurately identified the process by which a young teenage girl can get lured into a world in which they find themselves horrifically out of their depth. It had a young girl, maybe, what age would you guess from seeing her? 14 years old,
15,
maybe? 15.
Come on, baby, do you want me? Boy, don't you lie to me.
Full of adolescent frustration at the limits in her life and wanting to break bounds. A good-looking boy, a good few years older, but still a young man, maybe, early 20s, should we say?
Wanna come for a ride?
turning up in an attractive car, music pounding, that initial attraction, the flirting, the excitement, the ride, is all so accurate in terms of the way young teenage girls take the first steps into this world that in the worst cases, can lead to utter degradation.
It's all right. It's okay.
But however accurate the film was, there was one problem. It was never shown to its target audience.
What I was being told by the people on the ground who had been involved in making that film was that the single most important reason why that film has not been shown in schools is because the main groomer and abuser was an Asian man. And that was unacceptable. There was a terror of treading into what was seen as a cultural, ethnic minefield.
A second film was circulated, however.
My men, all right.
Look closely. It's not that hard to see the difference.
I'm Lauren. Oh, come in, Lauren. Nice to meet you.
He's a white teenager as opposed to a 20-something Asian.
He's a lad barely a couple of years older than the girls involved. You have a cast that is all white or African Caribbean, and no Asian men to be seen, as far as I can remember, in the entire film.
Between 1997 and 2010, there were 17 court cases linked to the group street grooming exploitation of young girls. Those cases led to 56 men being convicted. 3 were white. More than 40 were Pakistani heritage Muslims. Altogether, they abused over 200 victims. And the numbers are still growing.
We've just had a report earlier this year in Rotherham, an independent inquiry that has said in a town whose Pakistani community is less than 5% of the population, 1,400 predominantly young white teenage girls have been groomed and sexually abused, and the overwhelming majority of men involved in that were of Pakistani origin. That's a pattern that's been repeated in Bradford, in Leeds, in Manchester, in Blackburn, in Rochdale, in Preston, in Blackpool, in Derby, in Nottingham, in Birmingham. There are reasons why that has happened.
I wonder if at the heart of this was a mistake that we all made, that we gave people a kind of cultural exemption from normal, reasonable, decent behaviour.
Yeah. I think you're right, yes. I mean, because if you pretend it's not happening, as many people in Rotherham did, then you go down the road of condoning it. You're actually saying, this is all right, because it's what they do in that community. Well, it's not. It's not all right.
Hello, very nice to meet you.
Hi.
Good to see you. Windy but sunny. Good to see you. Thanks for all the help you're giving. Good to see you. It's very nice.
2010. Tony Blair's left the stage.
Very nice to meet you. How are you?
His successor, Gordon Brown, is out trying to win over hearts and minds on the election trail.
Wind, eh?
But the tectonic plates are already shifting. Even some of Labour's own supporters are having doubts about multicultural Britain. Enter Gillian Duffy.
But all these Eastern Europeans what are coming in, where are they flocking from?
A million people come from here, about a million people.
It's a disaster.
What did she say?
Oh, everything. She's just a sort of bigoted woman. Said she used to be Labour.
The episode helped to lose Labour the last election.
You said a bigot, and we want to know your response to that.
You're joking.
But actually, Gordon Brown wasn't the first to dismiss this kind of doubt.
As far as I can see, there's a bunch of fruitcakes and loonies and closet racists, basically.
With hindsight, it's clear that none of the political elites saw the wave of protest that was building. Last year, it broke on our shores. Matthew Goodwin is a political scientist. For years, he's been trying to persuade the main parties that they're missing a crucial message from the electorate. There's a group of voters who feel forgotten by the political mainstream.
There is a section of Britain's population that feels as though it is not getting its fair share and it is being left behind. You know, these people are profoundly unhappy, upset and angry about, you know, how Britain is changing and evolving. You know, we call these voters the left behind voters, older, white, not very well educated in comparison to other groups, profoundly angry with politicians in Westminster. You know, don't forget, these are voters who grew up before mass immigration, before Britain joined the European Union, before Britain had lost, you know, many of its colonies.
And now those left behind voters have found a new home.
The conventional wisdom about UKIP is this is a single issue Eurosceptic party that will go away once we give Nigel Farage and his followers a referendum. Not true. The reason that UKIP is surging is that UKIP is, if you like, a boat on much deeper social trends and changes in Britain.
Would you please give a warm welcome to Mark Reckless, Conservative Member of Parliament for Rochester Street.
UKIP has thrown British politics into turmoil. As the mainstream parties shed members, their grassroots base is growing rapidly. Today, UKIP regularly polls around 15%.
Today, I am leaving the Conservative Party
And they now have 2 members of Parliament.
This is astonishing. I've been going to party conferences for 30 years, and I don't think I've seen anything like this. This is passion unbridled. It's what every other political party at the moment has to manufacture and get spin doctors to work out. Actually, these guys really believe it. The problem is, for British people, we always say we like passion, but I suspect that a lot of us would find this level of passion a bit scary.
The conference delegates are a mixed bunch. The one thing that does unite them is their apparent dislike of what they would call the liberal metropolitan elite. Some of them thought I fitted the bill.
Yet they will see an open door to immigration to anyone from the European Union.
Maybe we can have a chat about it after he's finished speaking.
No, we're not.
We're not. Why not?
We're not.
Why not?
No. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to talk to you. Go away.
You've never met me. Why are you
Go
so angry
away.
with me?
Stop harassing me. You're harassing me.
Calm down.
Actually, for the most part, people here were pretty polite and friendly, though I left with no doubt that I stood for much of what they think is wrong with Britain today.
Hello, Trevor.
Comrade, how are you?
I made it just about. A little bit late. Lovely to see you. How are you?
In person, the leader of UKIP is disarmingly affable.
Where have you been? They sent out search parties and everything.
I know. I was delayed.
He's kept us waiting, but he doesn't waste any time before setting out his plan to destroy 10 years' hard work.
Do you think we've got too much discrimination legislation in this country?
Yes.
What would you get rid of?
Much of it. I think the situation that we now have, where an employer is not allowed to choose between a British-born person and somebody from Poland, is a ludicrous state of affairs.
That's a requirement of the European Union, but that has nothing to do with anti-discrimination legislation. But I just want to stick for the moment on the law that we've got, which says you may not discriminate on the basis of colour or indeed nationality. You'd get rid of that.
I think you should be able to choose on the basis of nationality. Yes, I do.
So in UKIP land, there would be no law against discrimination on the grounds of nationality. Would there be a law against discrimination on the grounds of race or colour?
No. We are colourblind. We as a party are colourblind.
We have these laws for a reason, you know. Before we had these laws, people would discriminate in favour of their families,
And
in people like them. And that led to, by the way, incompetence. Never mind the fairness question. People were employing people who couldn't do the job just because they looked like the employer.
If we'd sat here 40 years ago having this conversation, your point would probably have been valid. I don't think it is today. I mean, I really don't think it is today.
Okay. You said in various ways from time to time that there are things that cannot be said, that nobody in politics is willing to say. What things?
Well, the things that can't be said are that, I mean, for nearly 4 decades, but particularly since '97 when Blair took power, the argument was that immigration was a benefit to the country, that it broadened diversity and that it brought added wealth and increased GDP figures, and therefore the whole thing was good and shouldn't ever be open to question. So I've dared to challenge some of these things.
Who prevented anybody from talking about these things before?
Well, it's funny, I thought the problem was that a political class had become too close to each other, and that was really the problem that we had to crack. I've now rather moved on from that. I now think the media class are even worse.
Are you seriously saying that UKIP's success, it's due to the media suppressing the truth, it's down to politicians who are not courageous enough, it's down to anti-racists? And you know what I'm feeling? I'm feeling, Nigel Farage, you're talking about me.
I know.
Am I am I responsible for you?
Well, can I say honestly, frankly, you were one of those people that I viewed as being one of the causes of the problem. Yes, and I saw Trevor Phillips as being the enemy, very, very much, as being part of a new Labour project, and I saw you as being part of the politically correct brigade that wouldn't want these things discussed. So, yes, I did see you personally, as being very much a part of the problem.
I'd love to think that I was the main player in the changes to Britain that Nigel Farage so despises. But of course, I wasn't the principal architect of all this. The mission that I led was part of Tony Blair's wider project to modernise Britain. And make no mistake, I think we succeeded. I'd say that if you aren't white, the UK is the most welcoming country in Europe. But in spite of all that, I wonder if the way we got here has unleashed forces that could undo everything we achieved.
Here's what Nigel Farage says to be about you. He says, Tony Blair is the secret of my success. And you, Trevor, were Tony Blair's willing helper.
Let's just disaggregate some of those things that Mr. Farage is saying. I am in favour of integration of people coming into this country, and I'm against racial prejudice. I am in favour of a Britain that is open to the world, because I think that is the secret, in fact, of our economic success and our success as a country over the years. And the expression of anger, in the end, is not what is going to help anybody.
Look, I think we were very successful in changing attitudes on some social issues, gay rights, for example. On race, I now wonder whether actually what we ended up doing was making some people feel that they just couldn't say what they thought without being accused of being racists or bigots.
I mean, I don't really accept that. If you look at where we are today, and remember, I grew up in the 60s with sort of Enoch Powell and, Rivers of Blood and, really a pretty overt racism in many parts of the country. I think that's genuinely changed today. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't people who feel it's this sense of political correctness, but you get this in any decent cause. You end up, people go too far. Look, that just happens.
In a way, that's what my own basic worry is. But I wonder if people distorted the original idea to a point where actually you kind of invert things. We now have in some places a sense that all whites are kind of guilty and tainted, and somehow the new anti-racism has to some extent come to resemble the old racism in its inflexibility.
Right, and what I'm saying to you, Trevor, is I think you particularly, because you were a senior person in this whole debate at the time, You were never like that, and you always stood out against it. So I think you're flagellating yourself a little too much here. I mean,
I'm still fighting a battle, though.
Right, you are still fighting a battle, and it's an important battle, because I agree with you. It can go too far.
Well, let me ask you one more thing on this, which in a way makes it concrete. And this is not a trick question. It's not a trick question. It will sound like it.
That's not a good beginning, but anyway.
But one of the things that threw Labour off at the last election was the encounter between your successor and a woman called Julian Duffy. You'll remember the story.
I do.
How would Tony Blair have dealt with that encounter?
I would have said to her, I understand why you feel as you feel and why it's difficult, but here's the other side of the picture. So if we want to keep all those people out of the country, let's look at what their impact has actually been in our country, and let's look at why the idea in the European Union that people are able to move freely across frontiers is a good idea. I mean, you just got to put the argument. She probably wouldn't agree, and she might vote for someone else as a result. And just so I'm absolutely clear, I'm not saying everyone who votes for UKIP's a racist. I'm not saying that at all. You've got to understand the concerns people have, but you do have to expose the fact that what UKIP is offering is not an answer.
Since Tony Blair handed over the keys to number 10, the occupants have changed twice. And it's possible they'll change again this year. But whoever's behind the black door, they'll still face a problem. Tens of millions of voters across Europe think that the political elites favour minorities at their expense.
They also believe that if they say how they feel, they'll be called backward, or bigots, or racists by the liberal establishment. People like me, in fact. That's why they vote for UKIP here and for similar parties across the continent. OK, well, Tony Blair did win 3 elections. But I can't help but wonder if even he is underestimating the raw power of the wave of anger and resentment that Nigel Farage and his friends are riding.
I'd take to the streets to defend the equality laws I helped to create. And I'm never going to share Nigel Farage's enthusiasm for returning Britain to the past. But so far, I don't think that even Tony Blair has found a complete answer to UKIP's pessimism. I think we need to offer a new vision of a multi-ethnic society. And I may even have seen a glimpse of it in a small school on the outskirts of Leicester.
You're dad from Ghana? OK. Ah, we're probably cousins. Where?
My father's Irish and my mother's.
OK.
Mine's from Kenya.
Kenya? And Tanzania? OK. OK. Slovakia? OK. This is the United Nations Security Council. Thank you very much.
The children here come from 35 different countries and speak 46 different languages between them. Yet Babington's head teacher, Denise Newsom, presides over one of the most improved schools in the country. For her, diversity is not a burden, it's a benefit.
The data would suggest that our children who speak English as an additional language are outperforming other groups in the school. So that doesn't have to be one particular ethnic group, because our Asian children will do well, our Somali children do well, our Roma children are doing well.
So the kids who speak a different language at home are outperforming everybody else? That's pretty astonishing.
Newsom and her staff record the performance of every child meticulously. And that, I believe, is the secret of her success. She systematically analyzes the data to know exactly which children need the most attention and when.
Over the years, we have prioritised a range of groups. So when we had a big influx of Somali children, we prioritised them. When we had a big influx of Roma children, we spent a lot of time learning about their culture so that we could make a real difference here.
And guess who's the priority now?
Our focus this year is white British students, because we've, in a way, avoided doing that because we had all these new students, but actually they need a lot of input. It's a national issue. White British underachievement is a national issue.
And there's the great irony. the very group that most resents this kind of ethnic monitoring, the people that Nigel Farage thinks have been forgotten by the elite, are about to start benefiting from it. When you're able to look at the data without obsessing about racial prejudice or being afraid of being called racist, you can start giving help to those who most need it. That's true equality. The most important lesson I think I've learned is that preventing anyone from saying what's on their minds won't ever remove it from their hearts. People need to feel free to say what they want to without the fear of being accused of racism or bigotry. It means that we're all going to have to become more ready to offend each other. But that way, we might save some children's lives, and we might protect others from abuse. And in time, finally, we can begin to see each other in our true colours.